Okay, so what actually happens when a society is forced to share power? Does it unite the people, or does it completely tear the nation apart? Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're diving into a concept that's literally at the heart of how societies govern themselves: power sharing. If you've ever stopped and wondered how incredibly diverse nations manage to keep from falling apart, or on the flip side, why some countries tragically fracture, you are absolutely in the right place. We're going to unpack some powerful ideas today, drawing directly from a couple of seriously eye-opening case studies. Here's our roadmap for today. First, the power sharing equation. 2, Belgium, path of accommodation. 3, Sri Lanka, majoritarian rule. 4, why power sharing works. And finally, 5, Khalil's Lebanese dilemma. All right, let's jump straight into section 1, the power sharing equation. So there's this incredibly common, almost gut instinct belief out there in politics. Sharing power means dividing power. And while dividing power ultimately equals weakening the country. I mean, it makes a sort of simplistic sense, right? If you're a majority group in a democracy, why on earth would you just give up some of your control? Wouldn't that just slow everything down and make the whole nation weaker? Well, we're going to put this exact assumption to the test today. But before we really stress test that idea, we got to get our vocabulary straight. The conflicts we're exploring today are rooted in ethnic divisions. And what's fascinating about the word ethnicity is how broad it actually is. It's a social division based on shared culture, physical type, or common descent. The people in these groups deeply believe in their common descent. But, and this is a really key point here, they don't always necessarily share the same religion or even nationality. It's really all about a deep-seated shared identity. Moving right along to section 2, Belgium, path of accommodation. Okay, so Belgium. It's this small European country, population of a little over 1 crore, that's roughly 10 million folks. But its ethnic composition is remarkably complex. 59% of the population lives in the Flemish region and speaks Dutch. Another 40% live in the Wallonia region and speak French. And the remaining 1%, they speak German. Now, the historical tension here stems from the fact that the minority French-speaking community was relatively rich and powerful. And as you can probably guess, this caused some deep resentment among the Dutch-speaking majority, who kind of got the short end of the stick and only saw the benefits of economic development and education much later on. And geographically, this divide is super stark. The Dutch-speaking north sits right up against the French-speaking south. But notice that little island right in the middle of the Dutch region. That is the capital city, Brussels. And Brussels presented a totally unique headache. The Dutch-speaking people are the majority in the country as a whole, but inside the capital city of Brussels, 80% of the people speak French. It was basically a pressure cooker just waiting to explode in the 1950s and 60s. So how did they fix it? Well, the Belgian leaders took a path of extreme accommodation. Between 1970 and 1993, they literally amended their constitution 4 different times to create this totally innovative arrangement. First, they mandated that the number of Dutch and French-speaking ministers has to be exactly equal in the central government. That means no single community can just unilaterally push decisions through. Second, they handed massive powers over to the state governments, making them independent and not just subordinate to the center. Third, because the Dutch accepted equal representation at the center, the French returned the favor and accepted equal representation in a completely separate government just for Brussels. And finally, they set up a third tier called the community government. This one is elected by language groups, no matter where they live, to handle cultural and educational issues. I know, it sounds incredibly complicated, and honestly, it kind of is. But here's the thing. It actually worked in everyday life. Just look at this simple bilingual street sign. You've got both French and Dutch right there on the exact same marker. This is the daily, practical reality of accommodation. By actually respecting the feelings and interests of different communities, they completely avoided a messy civil strife and a potential partition of the whole country. In fact, their model was so remarkably successful that when the European Union formed, they actually chose Brussels to be their headquarters. Now, let's flip the script. Section 3, Sri Lanka, majoritarian rule. Sri Lanka is an island nation with roughly the same population size as Belgium, but the demographic reality there was a whole different ballgame. It's incredibly lopsided. You have this massive majority of Sinhala speakers, sitting at 74%, most of whom are Buddhist. Then you've got the Tamil speakers at 18% total, which breaks down into Sri Lankan Tamils at 13% and Indian Tamils at 5%, who are mostly Hindu or Muslim. And there's also a smaller Christian population in the mix. Now, similar to Belgium, there is a very strict geographic concentration here. The Sri Lankan Tamils are heavily clustered in the north and east of the country. Just imagine the dynamic for a second. You've got a massive Sinhala majority that could very easily just use its sheer numerical advantage to force its will on the entire country. And tragically, that is exactly what they did. The leaders of the Sinhala community sought to secure dominance over the government purely by virtue of their majority. They went all in on a philosophy called majoritarianism. This is essentially the belief that the majority communities should be able to rule a country in whichever way it wants, completely and deliberately disregarding the wishes and needs of the minority. Let's trace how this majoritarian approach actually played out. Sri Lanka gained independence in 1948. By 1956, they passed an act recognizing Sinhala as the one and only official language, just completely ignoring Tamil. Then, they followed that up with preferential policies that heavily favored Sinhala applicants for university positions and government jobs, plus a new constitution that explicitly fostered Buddhism. Naturally, this created this deep, deep feeling of alienation among the Sri Lankan Tamils. They felt their equal political rights were just being totally denied. They made peaceful demands for regional autonomy, and those were repeatedly rejected. By the 1980s, all this frustration birthed political organizations demanding a fully independent state, a Tamil Eelam in the north and east. This distrust escalated into widespread conflict and eventually an utterly devastating civil war that lasted all the way until 2009, causing terrible setbacks and forcing countless families to flee as refugees. So, the crucial takeaway here is this stark A/B test. In Belgium, leaders realized that national unity is really only possible by respecting the interests of different communities through mutually acceptable power-sharing arrangements. Sri Lanka shows us the exact opposite. When a majority community forces its dominance and outright refuses to share power, it doesn't make the country stronger. It severely undermines the unity of the nation and leads to absolute devastation. Which brings us to Section 4, Why Power Sharing Works. Our sources basically break the reasoning down into two main buckets. The first one is what we call prudential reasons. This just means basing decisions on prudence, or on a really careful, practical calculation of gains and losses. It's all about what works best in the real, messy world, regardless of any high-minded morality. So what are those careful calculations? Well, prudentially speaking, power sharing is good because it directly reduces the possibility of conflict between social groups. And we know that social conflict leads straight to violence and political instability. Therefore, sharing power is just a smart, highly practical way to ensure a stable political order. Imposing the will of the majority might look like a super attractive, fast option in the short run, but as Sri Lanka proved, it destroys the nation in the long run. The tyranny of the majority isn't just oppressive for the minority, it almost always ends up ruining the majority as well. But then there's the second, much deeper set of reasons, moral reasons. Power sharing is the very spirit of democracy itself. A truly democratic rule inherently involves sharing power with the people who are actually affected by its exercise. A legitimate government is one where citizens actually acquire a real stake in the system through active participation. Finally, let's wrap things up with Section 5, Khalil's Lebanese Dilemma. To really bring all this theory together, the source material introduces this awesome thought experiment. It's framed through a classic tale of Vikram driving a motorbike while Vedal the ghost tells him a story. Vedal tells Vikram about a man named Khalil who lives in the city of Beirut, Lebanon. Khalil is the product of a wonderfully mixed heritage. His dad is an Orthodox Christian and his mom is a Sunni Muslim. Now, this wasn't uncommon in cosmopolitan Beirut. Yet the different communities living together there ended up fighting a bitter, incredibly bloody civil war. To finally end this civil war, the leaders of Lebanon had to come together and hammer out a new set of rules for power sharing. And the rules they created are intensely rigid. By law, the country's president must belong to the Maronite sect of Catholic Christians. The prime minister must be a Sunni Muslim. The deputy prime minister is permanently fixed for an Orthodox Christian, and the Speaker of the House must be a Shia Muslim. It's this exact mathematically locked power-sharing pact based entirely on religious sects, all just to keep the peace. And that right there brings us to Khalil's dilemma, and the final question I want to leave you with today. See, Khalil doesn't actually practice either of his parents' religions. Yet in this system, he can never, ever aspire to the top posts in his own country, simply because he doesn't fit neatly into one of those predetermined religious buckets. Khalil just wants a normal democracy where anyone can run for anything, based on their merits, not their religion. But his elders, the people who actually lived through the bloodshed, they tell him this current system is literally the only thing keeping the peace. So what do you think? The prudential reasons for Lebanon's system are obvious. It stopped war. But morally,
Is a system where political positions are permanently fixed by religion truly a democratic power-sharing arrangement, or is it just a hostage exchange? Think back to that equation we started with. Sharing power doesn't weaken a country. Hoarding it does. But how we choose to share that power? Well, that is the great, messy challenge of modern democracy. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll see you in the next one.